Mike had always considered himself a man who knew exactly who he was. At 28, he had a stable job, a beautiful fiancée, and a future so neatly laid out that nothing could shake it. At least, that's what he told himself. Sarah had been his high school sweetheart, and their relationship had followed the expected course: dates, love, commitment, and eventually, an engagement. She was kind, supportive, and everything a man could ask for. But lately, Mike had started feeling something unsettling, a sense that something about his life was off. He couldn't name it, and he certainly couldn't talk about it. His best friend, Jason, had always been the wild contrast to his predictability. At 29, Jason was effortlessly charismatic, openly gay, and unapologetically himself. He had never hidden who he was, never cared for societal expectations. Jason had been there for Mike through everything: college struggles, first jobs, late-night drunken mistakes. They were inseparable, bonded by years of shared experiences and an understanding that didn't require words. Mike never questioned their friendship, never thought twice about Jason's presence in his life. But Sarah had. "You two are close," she had said once, a forced casualness in her voice. "I mean, I love Jason, but sometimes I wonder if he's a little too important to you." Mike had laughed it off. "He's my best friend, Sarah. That's all." She let the conversation drop, but the words lingered. Was Jason too important to him? The thought should have been ridiculous. Jason was family in every way but blood. He had seen Mike at his worst, had held him together during breakups, failures, and insecurities. Their friendship was unshakable. But then Jason had asked that question. It had been an ordinary night. Drinks at Jason's apartment, old stories, easy laughter. They had always been comfortable around each other, but this time, there was something different in the air, something unspoken weaving itself into the conversation. Then, out of nowhere, Jason had leaned back on the couch, swirling the whiskey in his glass, and smirked. "Mike, have you ever even kissed a guy?" Mike had laughed immediately, shaking his head. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one," Jason had said smoothly. "You're about to marry Sarah, settle into a life with her. But have you ever actually considered it?" Mike had scoffed, taking a sip of his drink, but his throat suddenly felt dry. "I'm straight, Jason. You know that." Jason had held his gaze for a moment too long, something unreadable in his expression. Then, with an almost lazy amusement, he had shrugged. "I just think it's interesting." "You've never even questioned it?" "Not once." Mike had wanted to shut the conversation down, to brush it off like any other joke Jason made. But something about the way he said it had stuck. Because Jason was right. He had never questioned it. Never allowed himself to. That night, Mike had gone home and found himself thinking about the question. He hadn't meant to, hadn't wanted to, but it lingered in his mind like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't the question itself that unsettled him. It was the fact that, for the first time, he didn't have an immediate, definitive answer. Lying in bed beside Sarah, staring at the ceiling, Mike tried to force the thoughts away. It didn't mean anything. Jason was just being Jason, provocative, playful. It was just a passing conversation. But as much as he wanted to believe that, something deep inside whispered otherwise. Because when Jason had asked if he had ever kissed a guy, what truly unsettled him wasn't that he hadn't. It was that, for the first time in his life, he wanted to. Mike had spent the last week convincing himself that Jason's question meant nothing. But no matter how many times he told himself that, it clung to him like an echo he couldn't silence. Every time he saw Jason, the words replayed in his mind. "Have you ever even kissed a guy?" He tried to shake it off, to go about his life as if nothing had changed. He went to work, came home to Sarah, answered her texts with the same affectionate normalcy. But at night, when the world was quiet and he was alone with his thoughts, he felt it creeping in, the question, the doubt, the curiosity. And Jason knew. Mike could see it in the way Jason watched him, a quiet amusement lurking behind his smirk. He wasn't pushing, wasn't forcing the conversation. He didn't need to. Jason had already done enough. He had planted the seed, and now he was simply waiting. It was a Friday night when Mike finally caved. Jason had invited him over for drinks, and Mike had accepted without thinking. Maybe that was his first mistake. Or maybe, deep down, he knew exactly why he was going. Jason's apartment had always felt different from his own. Where Mike's space was structured, organized, and designed to fit the image of his life with Sarah, Jason's was effortlessly lived in. Art scattered across the walls, vinyl records stacked in careless piles, a scent that was uniquely him, clean, sharp, with a hint of something intoxicating. They drank, talked, laughed. And yet, beneath it all, there was an undercurrent, a tension that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Mike caught himself watching Jason too closely. His mouth when he spoke, the way his fingers traced the rim of his glass. He noticed things he had never allowed himself to notice before. And then Jason leaned back, studying him. "You've been acting weird," he said casually. Mike forced a laugh, gripping his drink tighter. "You're imagining things." Jason arched a brow. "Am I?" Mike didn't answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. Then Jason leaned forward, voice lower, quieter. "You've been thinking about it, haven't you?" Mike's breath caught in his throat. "About what?" Jason's lips curled slightly. "The kiss." A rush of heat shot through Mike's chest. Anger, denial, something dangerously close to excitement. He opened his mouth to argue, to dismiss it, but nothing came out. Because Jason was right. Jason tilted his head, eyes sharp yet unreadable. "You can lie to yourself all you want, Mike. But not to me." Mike's pulse pounded. He should leave. He should laugh it off, grab his jacket, and walk out like this conversation had never happened. But he didn't. Jason's gaze dropped to his lips, just for a second. And that second was all it took. Mike moved first. He wasn't sure who he was in that moment, whether he was the man Sarah loved, the man he had always believed himself to be, or someone entirely new. But right now, he didn't care. His lips met Jason's hesitantly at first, testing, unsure. But the second he felt Jason respond, felt the way Jason's hand slid to his jaw, pulling him closer, it was over. The hesitation shattered. The kiss deepened, urgency crashing over them like a wave. Mike's hands found Jason's shoulders, gripping tightly, pulling instead of pushing away. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, before the weight of reality could crash down on him. Jason's fingers tangled in Mike's hair, his body pressing closer, and God, it felt good. Too good. Mike should have stopped. He didn't. Instead, he let himself sink into it, the heat, the hunger, the electric thrill of something forbidden yet completely, devastatingly right. And then, just as suddenly, he pulled away. Breathing hard, he stared at Jason, heart hammering. His mind screamed at him to say something, to explain, to make sense of what had just happened. Jason only watched him, lips swollen, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smirked. "I think you just answered your own question," Jason murmured. Mike swallowed hard, his entire body thrumming with adrenaline. He needed to leave. Needed to escape before he did something he couldn't take back. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. But as he stepped into the cool night air, one undeniable truth settled over him. This wasn't a mistake. And worse, he didn't want it to be. Mike had convinced himself that it was a one-time thing. That kiss, that mistake, had been nothing more than a moment of weakness, a slip in judgment fueled by alcohol and curiosity. He had told himself that over and over again. But if it had been just a mistake, then why couldn't he stop thinking about it? Days passed, but the memory of Jason's lips, the way his hands had gripped him, how effortlessly he had fallen into it, it was all-consuming. The weight of it sat heavy in his chest, an ache that refused to fade. He avoided Jason at first, ignoring texts, making excuses. It wasn't difficult. Sarah filled his days with wedding plans, blissfully unaware that her fiancé was unraveling beneath the surface. She would talk about floral arrangements, venue choices, and Mike would nod, pretending to listen. Pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Because every time Sarah kissed him, every time she said, "I love you," all Mike could think about was Jason. It took less than a week for Jason to break the silence. "Jason, are we just pretending it didn't happen?" Mike had stared at the message for a long time, his fingers hovering over his phone, debating whether to respond. He shouldn't. He should delete it, erase Jason from his life, go back to the man he was before that night. But instead, his fingers moved. "Mike, I don't know what you want me to say." "Jason, I want you to be honest with yourself for once." Mike had almost thrown his phone across the room. Jason didn't understand. He didn't know what it was like to have an entire life built on an identity that now felt like a lie. And yet, despite the anger, despite the fear, he texted Jason back anyway. That was how it started. One message turned into another. Then a phone call. Then another late-night visit to Jason's apartment. Then another kiss. And another. Until it wasn't just a kiss anymore. Until Mike found himself in Jason's bed, tangled in sheets and limbs, losing himself in something that felt too right to be wrong. He told himself it was just physical, just a way to get it out of his system before he could marry Sarah with a clear conscience. But that was a lie. Because when he was with Jason, he didn't think about Sarah. Didn't think about wedding plans or the life he was supposed to be living. He only thought about Jason. It wasn't long before Sarah started noticing the changes. "You've been distracted lately," she said one night, curling into his side on the couch. "Is something wrong?" Mike forced a smile, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Just work stress." She accepted the answer, but her eyes lingered on him for a beat too long. And the guilt ate him alive. But it wasn't enough to stop. Because every time he told himself it was the last time, he would find himself back at Jason's door, desperate for something he couldn't name. Until Jason finally said the words that shattered the illusion. They were lying in bed, Jason tracing patterns over Mike's bare shoulder, his voice quieter than usual. Mike stiffened. "Jason. I mean it." Jason sat up, eyes dark. "I'm not playing this game, Mike. Either you figure out what the hell you want or you leave." Mike clenched his jaw. "You know I can't just walk away from everything. I'm engaged." Jason scoffed. "Engaged to a woman you can barely look in the eye anymore." Mike flinched. Jason exhaled, softer this time. "I know you're scared. But you can't keep pretending." Mike wanted to argue. Wanted to tell Jason he was wrong, that this didn't mean anything. But the truth was staring him in the face. Because when he looked at Sarah, he felt guilt. When he looked at Jason, he felt everything else. And for the first time, that terrified him more than the guilt ever could. Mike had never been a liar. At least, that's what he used to believe. But now? Now, he was lying every single day, to Sarah, to Jason, and most of all, to himself. The weight of it pressed against his chest, suffocating him. Every moment with Sarah felt forced, every touch rehearsed. She didn't deserve this. She deserved honesty, commitment, a man who wasn't falling in love with someone else. And Jason? Jason had made it clear. He wouldn't be Mike's secret forever. Something had to give. Mike sat in his car outside Jason's apartment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His phone buzzed. "Sarah. Sarah, hey babe. Are you coming home soon?" He stared at the screen, fingers trembling. Home. That word felt foreign now, like it belonged to a life he wasn't sure was his anymore. He didn't reply. Instead, he turned off the engine, climbed out, and walked up the familiar steps to Jason's door. When Jason opened it, his expression was unreadable. "I was wondering how long you'd sit out there." Mike sighed. "We need to talk." Jason didn't move. "Yeah. We do." The door shut behind them, and Mike felt the tension settle between them like a physical thing. "I can't keep doing this," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. Jason leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Then don't. Mike let out a humorless laugh. It's not that simple. Jason's jaw tightened. It is, Mike. You're the one making it complicated. Mike met his gaze, feeling something crack inside him. I love her. The words came out almost desperate, as if saying them could make them true. Jason studied him, then nodded slowly. Okay. Mike exhaled, relief flooding him, until Jason took a step closer. But do you love me? Mike's breath caught. Jason. Answer the damn question. Silence. Mike's heart pounded, his throat tightening. He wanted to deny it, to insist this was nothing more than confusion, temptation, something temporary. But he couldn't, because the truth was staring him in the face. His voice faltered. I don't know. Jason's expression flickered, hurt, anger, understanding, all at once. He nodded once, then stepped back. I can't do this anymore. Mike felt something inside him splinter. Jason, please. Jason's eyes burned into him. You don't get to please me, Mike. You don't get to string me along while you hide behind your perfect little life. Mike swallowed hard. I don't want to lose you. Jason's laugh was bitter. Then choose me. Mike opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Jason shook his head. That's what I thought. For the first time in his life, Mike realized that silence was its own kind of betrayal. Jason turned away. Go home, Mike. And this time, Mike knew, Jason wasn't waiting anymore. When Mike walked into his apartment, Sarah was waiting on the couch, her eyes filled with something close to fear. Where were you? She asked softly. Mike's stomach twisted. No more lies. His voice was barely above a whisper. With Jason. Something in her face crumbled. She nodded slowly, as if she had known all along. Are you in love with him? Mike's chest tightened. He could lie. Tell her it was nothing, that it was a mistake. He could salvage the life they had built, force himself back into the role he was supposed to play. But the weight of everything came crashing down, and the truth slipped out before he could stop it. I think so. Sarah's breath hitched. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then whispered, I knew. Mike's heart clenched. Sarah. I just didn't want to believe it. Silence. Heavy, suffocating. Then, finally, she stood, her voice steady but laced with quiet devastation. I deserve someone who chooses me first. Mike felt the sting of her words like a blade to his chest. But he didn't argue. Because she was right. Sarah walked to the bedroom, pausing at the door. I'll start packing in the morning. And just like that, the life Mike had built, the life he had spent years convincing himself was the right one, was gone. But as he stood there, staring at the empty space where Sarah had been, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. Because now, finally, he knew the truth. And he knew exactly where he needed to be.